Liam couldn't escape the feeling that Johnson was everywhere. Even when he wasn't in the room, he lingered in Liam's mind, in the way his skin burned with phantom touches, in the way Daniel's presence now felt like a chain instead of an anchor. The affair was a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. But it wasn't just the guilt that gnawed at him now. It was something darker, sharper, fear. Because Johnson wasn't letting go. Daniel's growing suspicion. Liam sat across from Daniel at the dinner table, barely touching his food. The air between them was shifting, strained, uneasy. Daniel set his fork down and studied him. "You're not yourself." Liam forced a tight smile. "Work's been exhausting." Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not stupid, Liam." Liam's stomach clenched. "What?" Daniel folded his arms. "You're distracted all the time. You barely sleep. You flinch when your phone buzzes. And you smell like someone else." Liam's throat went dry. "That's not." "Don't lie to me." Daniel's voice was calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something cracking. Liam looked away, guilt pressing against his ribs like a blade. He wanted to tell the truth. He wanted to confess everything. But then what? Johnson wouldn't disappear. So instead, he whispered, "There's nothing going on." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he didn't push either. He just nodded once, stood, and left the table. Liam knew what that meant. Daniel didn't believe him, and that was dangerous. Liam should have cut all contact. He should have blocked Johnson, should have gone home that night and told Daniel everything. Instead, he found himself standing in a dimly lit parking lot, heart pounding as Johnson leaned against his car, smirking. "You're late," Johnson murmured. Liam exhaled sharply. "I can't do this anymore." Johnson tilted his head. "You keep saying that." "This time, I mean it." Johnson's smirk faded. He stepped forward, eyes dark, voice low. "Do you love him?" Liam swallowed hard. "Yes." A beat of silence. Then Johnson laughed softly. "No, you don't." Liam's pulse roared in his ears. "This is over." Johnson's expression shifted. "Something cold, something dangerous. You think you get to decide that?" Liam took a shaky step back. "Stay away from me. Stay away from Daniel." Johnson smiled then, slow, calculated. "If I can't have you, Liam," he murmured, "he won't either." Liam barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside the window, it all felt like Johnson. He woke to the sound of the shower running. Daniel was up early. Liam sat up, rubbing his hands over his face, his mind racing. He had to fix this. Then his phone buzzed. "You should tell him before I do." Liam's stomach twisted violently. He bolted out of bed, panic surging through his veins. He could let Johnson get to Daniel first. The moment Daniel stepped out of the bathroom, Liam was already speaking. "We need to talk." Daniel, towel draped around his waist, frowned. "About what?" Liam's throat tightened. He had to tell the truth. Before he could speak, the doorbell rang. A chill ran down his spine. He knew. Daniel gave him a confused look before heading to the door. Liam followed, heart hammering against his ribs. Daniel pulled the door open, and there stood Johnson, calm, smiling, like he belonged there. Daniel blinked. Can I help you?" Liam stepped forward, quickly. "Johnson, don't." Johnson's smirk deepened. "Oh, so he doesn't know me." Daniel's entire body tensed. His eyes flicked between them, realization dawning, horror settling in. "Liam," Daniel said slowly. "What the hell is going on?" Liam's mouth opened, but no words came out. Johnson chuckled. "Tell him, baby." Daniel turned to Liam, eyes burning. "Baby?" Silence. Crushing, suffocating silence. Then Daniel exhaled sharply. "How long?" Liam swallowed hard. "Daniel, please." "How long?" Daniel's voice cracked, his hands trembling. Liam's vision blurred. "It's over. It's done." Johnson scoffed. "No, it's not." Daniel turned to Johnson then, expression dark. "You're a real piece of work, aren't you?" Johnson's smirk never wavered. "You have no idea." And then, before Liam could react, Daniel lunged. Liam barely had time to register what was happening before fists were flying. Daniel slammed Johnson against the wall, rage bleeding from his every movement. "You think you can walk into my house, into my marriage?" Johnson laughed, even as Daniel's grip tightened. "I already have." Daniel's fist collided with Johnson's face. A sickening crack. Liam grabbed Daniel's arm. "Stop. Just stop." But Daniel wasn't listening. He was past reason, past logic. Johnson wiped blood from his lip, then grinned. "That all you got?" Liam's heart pounded. This wasn't going to end well. He pulled Daniel back, desperate. "He's not worth it. Just let him go." Daniel turned to Liam, pain flashing in his eyes. "Is that what you've been telling yourself?" Liam froze. Johnson laughed softly, stepping back. "See you around, lovebirds." And then he was gone. Liam turned to Daniel, voice shaking. "I'm sorry." Daniel stared at him for a long, excruciating moment. Then he stepped back. "I don't even know who you are." The words cut deeper than any knife. And as Daniel walked away, Liam realized this wasn't just a mistake. This was destruction. And Johnson wasn't done yet. David had convinced himself that what happened in the bedroom was nothing, just a moment of misplaced glances and tension that could be ignored. But Noah wasn't ignoring it. Over the next few days, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. Noah's presence felt heavier, his eyes lingering longer, his movements deliberate. There was a quiet confidence in him, an awareness that made David uneasy, not because he feared it, but because he wanted it. It started with small things. A brush of fingers when passing in the kitchen. A smirk that held too much meaning. A comment, low and smooth, designed to make David wonder if he was imagining it. And then one evening, when Claire was out late, it escalated. David was in the living room, nursing a drink, pretending to watch the television. The air conditioning hummed, filling the silence that stretched too thin between him and Noah, who sat across from him, legs sprawled out, confidence practically radiating from him. "You've been weird lately," Noah said suddenly, breaking the silence. David glanced up. "Weird how?" Noah shrugged, but his eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "Avoiding me, acting like something happened when it didn't." David's fingers tightened around his glass. He had expected this, expected Noah to push. What he hadn't expected was how much he wanted to be pushed. "You walked into my room without knocking," David said, keeping his voice measured. "That's all." Noah's smirk deepened. "Right. That's all." A pause. Then softer. "You sure about that?" David exhaled slowly, setting his drink down. He should shut this down. Right now. But instead, he met Noah's gaze head-on, letting the moment stretch just long enough to be dangerous. Noah moved first. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just a shift forward, closing the space between them inch by inch. David should have stood up, walked away, said something, anything, to break the moment before it could swallow them both. But he didn't, because as soon as Noah was close enough, their knees brushing, the warmth of his body radiating across the narrow distance, David felt something inside him snap. A hand brushed his wrist, barely a touch, but it sent a pulse through him that he couldn't ignore. "This isn't," David started, but the words faltered when Noah leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "I think it is." David's pulse pounded. He was seconds away from making a decision he couldn't take back. His mind screamed at him to stop, to remember the lines that weren't meant to be crossed, but his body was already betraying him. Then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. David jerked back as it burned, breathing hard. "Claire." Noah sat back just as smoothly, stretching as though nothing had happened, but his eyes never left David's. He didn't look disappointed. He looked like he had all the time in the world. David stood abruptly, running a hand over his face as the front door opened. Claire's voice called out from the hallway, and suddenly, everything snapped back into place. The house, the marriage, the life he had built. He turned to Noah one last time, trying to find something, regret, hesitation, anything to tell him that this was just a mistake. But all he saw was a knowing smile. And David knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. David had spent the past few days convincing himself that the moment in the living room was meaningless, that nothing had happened, that he was still in control. But Noah had other plans. Every glance across the dinner table, every casual touch in passing, every knowing smirk, it was deliberate, calculated. Noah was waiting for David to crack. And David knew it was only a matter of time. One evening, when Claire had gone to visit her sister, David found himself alone in the house with Noah again. It was the worst possible situation to be in. Or maybe, deep down, it was exactly what he'd been waiting for. The night was quiet, the air thick with something unspoken, as David poured himself a drink in the dimly lit kitchen. He told himself he was just unwinding, that the tension knotting in his stomach was from stress, not from the weight of anticipation. But then Noah appeared, leaning against the doorway with that same unreadable expression, like he knew exactly what was happening. "You look tense," Noah said, stepping forward. David let out a low breath, setting his glass down. "Long day." Noah's lips twitched. "Sure, that's it." David turned to face him, jaw tight. "What do you want, Noah?" A slow shrug. A step closer. Too close. "I think you know." David's pulse pounded in his ears. He should shut this down. Right now. This was the moment of no return. But then Noah's fingers brushed against David's wrist, light as a whisper. And David didn't move away. The silence stretched, heavy, charged. David could hear the sound of his own breathing, could feel the heat radiating from Noah's body. He knew if he spoke now, his voice would betray him. Noah tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You keep fighting it," he murmured. "Why?" David exhaled shakily. "Because I should." Noah's gaze darkened. "And do you want to?" David didn't answer, because the truth was a betrayal in itself. Then Noah moved, slow, deliberate, closing the last of the space between them. David's breath hitched. This was it. The moment he either stopped everything or let it happen. And then, a noise. The distant chime of Claire's car unlocking in the driveway. David pulled back like he'd been burned, stepping away so fast he nearly knocked over his glass. His pulse was racing, his body betraying the war in his mind. Noah, however, just smiled, not disappointed. "Patient. This isn't over," Noah murmured. "You know that, don't you?" David swallowed hard, turning away as Claire's footsteps approached the front door. He knew, and that was the problem, because he wasn't sure he wanted it to be. David barely slept that night. Lying beside Claire, he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in knots. He had come so close, too close. If Claire hadn't arrived when she did, there was no telling what would have happened. Or maybe there was. He ran a hand over his face, tried to shake the weight pressing against his chest. The tension with Noah had gone too far, turned into something dangerous, something that could shatter everything. And yet the worst part? He didn't regret it. The next morning, David went through the motions of normalcy. Breakfast, small talk, kisses on the cheek. Claire had no idea that her husband was unraveling, that he was standing at the edge of a choice that could destroy their marriage. But Noah knew, when their eyes met over breakfast table, there was no smirk this time, no teasing remark, just knowing, and that was what terrified David the most. Later that evening, Claire announced she had a dinner with friends, leaving David and Noah alone in the house again. The silence between them stretched as the door clicked shut. David stood in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter. He could hear Noah moving behind him, slow and deliberate. He didn't turn around. If he did, he wasn't sure he could stop himself. "This is driving you crazy, isn't it?" Noah's voice was quiet but firm. David exhaled. "You think this is a game?" Noah took a step closer. "No, I think this is real. And I think you know it too." David clenched his jaw. He did know it. That was the problem. Silence fell again. Noah was waiting for David to either step forward or step away. David turned, meeting Noah's gaze. He wasn't a kid playing games. He knew exactly what he was doing. And David had a choice to make. The air felt electric, charged with everything that had been building for weeks. David's pulse pounded. One step forward, and everything would change. One step back, and maybe, just maybe, he could salvage what was left of his restraint. His breath was unsteady as he made his decision, and when he moved, he knew there was no going back.